So, my name is Nicolas Checa. I'm from the United States. I live in New York, and so I'm playing, upstairs, obviously, as everyone else is. Where are you guys from?
France.
And you're playing in the tournament too?
Yes.
How are you guys doing?
For me, it's fine.
It's good. You?
Pretty bad. It's like the second time I play a tournament. It's
Yeah.
very hard.
Definitely. Yeah, it is. Tournaments they just keep getting harder, right? So what I wanted to show is I have two games here. Both of them are my games that I've played, and I wanted to go through them with really the focus on the endgame here, specifically the bishop versus knight endgames, which is it's a pretty narrow area, but they happen very frequently in my opinion, because it's an imbalance that a lot of people like to take advantage of. And you can see in the first game was actually a blitz game, but I played against David Navarra just online, and in that game I had the bishop, so the bishop versus the knight. And then the second game I want to show is the kind of opposite, where I had the knight versus the bishop. So what I'm trying to show basically the basic ideas with when you have both the knight and the bishop, so both sides of the same situation. But obviously we're going to go through the whole game and see everything that's going on. So all the opening and the middle game, everything that evolves into that, and how that imbalance plays out. So this first game here that you can see behind me is my game against David Navarra. So I was white here, and so yeah, it started with d4, and this is a Slav defense.
We just played this in the terrace.
Oh really? So the Slav here, and then with e3. So
it's his move.
This is the same as your game? Yeah. So yeah, e3 is definitely it's considered the more solid approach. The other move would be knight c3 is the main move, but that gives a little bit more options, because d takes c4 can be played, or e6, which is the semi-Slav.
Yeah, and complicated lines with bishop g5.
Exactly. Yeah, you know your theory, huh? So e3 is considered a little bit more of a slow, quieter approach. The benefit is that the pawn is defended immediately, but I guess the drawback is this bishop on c1 is kind of blocked in. So that's the situation. So my opponent played bishop g4. So usually the idea is for black is that they usually want to develop the bishop and bring it basically outside the pawn chain before playing a move like e6. So the idea is with the bishop already outside, e6 wouldn't block the bishop in. So that's the benefit. The problem is that the bishop here can be a little bit vulnerable, as you'll see soon. So knight c3 is another developing move. You always want to develop. e6, and here the bishop is getting attacked. So this is what I was talking about before. The bishop on c8, although it is passive and blocked in, it can't really be attacked. But from g4, it can be a problem. So black really has two options here. One of which would be to take. And the problem with this is that this was a very solid position. Black really has no weaknesses, but has the long-term static disadvantage of the two bishops. Pretty much what's going to happen eventually, white's going to try to play e4, and the idea is with the open position, this bishop's probably going to come here, and they're going to be strong, and white has a long-term advantage, basically.
So you played g4 after?
Yeah, so he played bishop h5 and then g4, you're right. So then bishop g6, and then the move knight e5. So just really targeting the bishop, that's the whole plan so far. So basically, white has a very direct threat here. So what do you think white's immediate threat is?
Is h4.
h4, yeah, that's right. So the idea would be after, let's say, a passive move like bishop e7, h4 is a real problem, because this bishop is running out of squares. And usually you'd respond to something like this with a move like h6, but in this situation, you're going to be forced to take this, which really ruins your pawn structure. Because if white takes immediately, then he wants to take back with the h-pawn, and this structure is much more solid, it opens the rook up. But if you're forced to move the h-pawn, then it's a real problem. And if you don't, then the next move is going to be will be h5, and this bishop is in trouble. And then so let's say make a waiting move here, h5, bishop e4, and now here f3, and this bishop's really completely just out of space. So to deal with that, black really needs to rely on some actually tactics to make sure everything works. So the move here is knight to d7. And the idea is, actually I'll let you think of the idea. So basically, how would black respond to h4? It requires a bit of calculation, but
I guess
take on where?
Take the knight.
The problem with taking the knight here is that you're going to take back with the tempo.
Okay.
And then let's say the knight moves, then h5 again is creating the same problem.
Okay.
So you need to moves like h6 and h5 are obviously they're going to save the piece, but you're going to have long-term problems in the g6 square.
Is this theory?
I don't know if this is knight d7 is definitely theory. I think most people don't play h4 because of the reason we'll find together, but
so there is a then it should be g4. No.
Stable. What are you thinking?
I don't know, because I don't know. I was looking at knight takes g4, but it looks like it's anywhere but a piece down, so I have no idea. Maybe let's say queen takes. No, we have nothing.
Right. If knight takes g4, is just going to be losing a piece. Knight e4, which then, with the computer suggested, also really doesn't quite work because of h5, and this bishop's just running out of room.
Yeah. So I have no idea. Maybe bishop b4?
Bishop b4 here?
Yeah, but still same.
But still the problem with h5.
Yeah. I guess it has something to do with the last move, with the knight d7 help in any way.
The knight d7 is definitely going to be valuable. So the critical move here is to take on c4. So basically what this is doing is
creating a new square.
Creating a new square on d3. So after h5,
d5 also. Yeah.
h5, then the bishop has the option of d3.
Oh.
But more importantly, there's a tactical justification, is that it's actually opening this whole diagonal, which is a little bit paradoxical, but you'll see what I mean. This line, this file. Because after h5 now, you can actually take here. And if your pawn takes, the queen trade. So now there's really two ways to take back. If the king takes back, you could play knight takes g4, and after you take this, there's knight takes f2, which forks the king and the rook. The other option would be knight to d1, and then now you have bishop e4, because the knight has vacated this square in c3, so that there's an extra square. So this is really a nice tactical justification for how you can develop. And this is really, I'd say, common in Grandmaster games, is what you see is what I would call a tactical justification for the positionally most ideal move. So in a position like this, you want to develop, you want to get your pieces out, and instead of the more defensive approach against this h4 idea in a lot of positions is usually to play this knight here. The purpose of this being that after h4, when you trade, it's not, the pawn here isn't attacking anything. The problem is that retreating a knight is not the most positionally ambitious move. So the purpose of knight d7 is using these tactics to justify your positional goals. And that's, I think, a very common thing you see.
Black is better at the end of the line, or
after h4, d takes c4, I think the best move would be to take here and just take here, and it's kind of equal material.
So you take.
But black's managed to develop, and black doesn't really have any weaknesses, so it's.
You have 2 bishops,
but the king's a little.
Yeah.
It's a standard position, I would describe it as. It's nothing that it's just normal. But the point is that black has to calculate or figure out all these tactics just to justify a simple developing move. And I think one of the things that a lot of people see is that when you do a lot of tactics puzzles online or in books, they're usually, you find a tactical sequence to win a piece or to win a pawn or to get some very concrete benefit. But I think a lot of the tactics you see in games are actually to really justify what you want to do in terms of, developing a piece or accessing a square or, fixing your pawn structure or whatever the positional goal would be. And I think this is a perfect example where you're here stopping h4 with this dc4 in order to develop a piece. So because of all that, I didn't play h4, and I took on g6 instead. And after takes back, I played g5. So black really, I guess, has 4 options, right? You have knight g8, knight h7, knight h5, and knight e4. And it's really, you basically just have to choose between them. So immediately the worst one would be knight h7, because after something like f4, this knight is really, really passive. The only place it can go is f8. And from there, it can't go to either one of these places. So really, the only path this knight ever has is to come here and then back here. Unfortunately, this knight is currently there. Now, this knight also has nowhere to go because they can't come here, here, or
so
here.
You would have to b8.
So none of these knights are good. So this is just not really. This is the reason that people say that when you have less space, you want to trade.
Yeah.
And the reason is that you see, black here is very cramped. And the problem is that all his pieces, since he has so few squares, they're all occupying the same squares. Like 3 different pieces want to be on f8 right now, and then 2 different pieces want to be on d7. So that's why when you have so many pieces with a limited space, it's a real problem. Another possible move would be knight h5, but knight h5 runs into a similar problem. That after, let's say, h4, this knight has no moves. It can never go to g7, never go to f6. It's just basically stuck. There is a saying that the knight on the rim is dim in English, they call it. And you can see the problem here. Also, there's no way of this pawn, either one of these pawns ever moving. They're completely fixed. So this square is never going to be vacated. And this structure is pretty locked in. So
if pawn was on h7 instead of the g6, maybe g6.
Maybe g6. But here for the time being, black's almost down a piece because this knight is stuck. Also, this knight's blocking the rook. It's just a bad situation. So the 2 main moves would be knight to g8. The idea of knight g8 is that here there's a legitimate path to return, which would be knight e7 to knight f5. And the knight on f5 is actually quite nice because since this pawn has already gone over here, you can never play g4 to attack the knight. So it's almost like an outpost. And e4 would always be met by takes, so the knight can really never be dislodged or removed from f5.
F3 and e4
F3 and e4 is an idea, but the knight is much stabler there than it would be on h7, let's say. And then there's the move that was played in the game, which was knight to e4. So the idea of knight to e4 is, like I said before, black has much less space, so you want to trade pieces because you don't want your pieces to be stumbling over each other, so to speak, when in the limited space. So the one drawback is that after knight takes and pawn takes, black's pawn structure is a little bit compromised here, right? Because he has double pawns in the g file and double pawns in the e file. That being said, white's structure is a little strange too because this pawn's advanced and there is an immediate queen takes g5 threat to just take a pawn. So I'd say the move here for white would be pretty intuitive, which is just to play h4. Protects the pawn that's hanging. Other moves like, let's say, rook g1 wouldn't be quite as good because rook h4 even. And essentially you're going to be separating these pawns. Yeah. So these pawns are both almost isolated at this point. But when the pawn's on h4, the pawns are more connected. So he played bishop b4. bishop d2, queen a5. And here, this is another example of the tactical justification. So that black is using to defend. So the what would you guys describe as the most intuitive move for white here? Just the kind of logical developing move that's attacking things.
A3 seems logical.
A3 is the best move. So A3 is the best move here. But there's also a move that doesn't work that looks like it should.
You think about bishop takes and queen 2?
The move I was talking about was bishop g2, which is bishop g2, just developing a piece and also attacking the pawn on e4.
F5?
F5, after en passant, knight takes, these pawns are a little worse.
Okay.
But the refutation is actually, it's like quite a surprising move. The move is knight to e5.
Nice.
And the idea would be that after knight to e5 takes, and then you can basically castle, and then you're going to win the bishop here. There are other variations here. After something like, let's say, bishop e4, you have knight c4, takes, and now you're going to win the pawn on b2.
Should be good.
I think that the best move here, after something like bishop b4, you can take, and knight c4, and then knight d6, which protects everything. So there's several approaches to deal with this. I actually played this exact position as black in a game once. I believe my opponent he played. I think the best move is I don't quite remember the best move. The best move may actually be king e2, which is doesn't make a lot of sense, but the point is that knight e5 basically prevents bishop g2 and forces a3. So this is another kind of tactical justification, because positionally bishop g2 makes a lot of sense. And then this white would be very happy to get to this endgame with these pawns being so weak. But instead, this knight e5 resource is able to keep black making these developing logical moves. So you can see the pattern here that black is relying on some of these tactics to hold his position together. And the reality is that they all work out just fine, so it winds up being relatively equal. So like you mentioned a3. So after a3, I played bishop d4, which is similar to a3, and queen d2. a3 is slightly better than bishop b4 because the pawn on a3 is a little bit better to just control some more squares, but they become very similar.
Yeah, to go before.
So we traded here, and then he played f5. The idea of f5 is to really solidify this pawn on e4 because bishop g2 remained a threat in the previous position. After, let's say, a boring move like king e7, bishop g2 is a problem, and black would be reluctant to get into this situation with these pawns like this. So instead, after f5, I think we could say we've really arrived in the bishop versus knight endgame, which is really the subject. So this is all, before this you could say was the opening, and it was a bit of a brief middle game because the queens got traded so early. But here is where you have to really analyze the position and view it from a fresh point of view. So if you look at it, it's equal material, right? 8 pawns versus 8 pawns. And 2 rooks. So the only real imbalance would be the pawn structure and the bishop versus the knight. So right now you can see it's a very closed position. You see there's no open files and there's really no open diagonals. So the general rule the two general rules, in my opinion, for the bishop versus knight endgames is that you want to have pawns on both sides of the board. So meaning you want pawns on the queen side and the king side, and you want an open position where the bishop has the maximum amount of scope, or the maximum amount of power. The reason you want the pawns on both sides of the board is because the knight is basically a short range piece, and by that means it can really go a maximum of 2 files to the right or to the left at any time, and the knight can really only control squares that are very close to it. The bishop, on the other hand, is a long range piece, so it has much more scope, but it can also. The point is, with pawns on both sides of the board, it can be useful on the king side and the queen side simultaneously. Like, for example, this is very theoretical, but a bishop on e4 would be controlling squares like d7 and h7, so it'd be attacking both. Not in this specific example, but.
So you want to achieve that?
So yeah, you want to have pawns on both sides of the board, and you want to have an open position.
So bishop g2 and f3.
Bishop g2 and f3 is that's a good idea, but there's basically a faster way of. And the third rule, which is so there's you want to open position and pawns on both sides of the board, and then the third one is you typically want your opponent's pawns on the same color as your bishop. Now in this case, white already has that because all these black pawns are already on light squares, which makes them easy targets for this bishop. The thing is that sometimes these pawns can be, if the position is closed, the pawns can be blocking the bishop in. Right now, I would argue these pawns are actually a strength because they're really blocking the bishop. All the diagonals are blocked. But if the bishop can get in behind, let's say to c8, for example, when you're attacking them, it would be a real liability to have all these pawns on light squares. So you see here, there's an immediate opportunity here for white to open the position. Or not completely open it, but just gradually start to open it.
So
I'll give you a hint. The last move was f5.
does d5 make any sense? En passant.
Yeah, en passant. So after e takes f6, again, you're already opening a file.
Yeah.
Opening this diagonal a bit, opening this diagonal a bit. The bishop is just gradually going to get stronger and stronger. So after taking back with a knight would be just not a great idea because these pawns on g6, both pawns being doubled and isolated would be a long-term disadvantage. Takes back the pawn and then develop the bishop. The bishop developing move is less about the bishop and more about getting a rook to the g file because you want to put pressure on the pawns. But the bishop here is a little bit better. So he played f5. So again, what he's trying to do right now is he's trying to put all his pawns on the same color of my bishop, which is a bit of a risk, but the idea is that right now he's betting that his pawns on the same color of my bishop are going to restrain my bishop, and that they're going to basically be a blockade against my bishop. But my bet here with the bishop is that my pawns are going to be able to, my bishop is going to be able to target all these pawns since they're fixed on light squares. For example, if I had a dark square bishop, I could really never attack any of these pawns. But as with light squared bishop, I can attack everyone except for a7. So I played rook g1, king f7, and here I have another opportunity to open the position, which is really kind of the theme. So h5 and f3, which one do you think is better?
I think h5.
Yeah, h5 is what I chose. F3 is definitely a good move, but the problem I think is that knight to f6, and you're not really opening up because here you've opened up the position, but at the price you've really activated the black knight. And here you have problems because king d3 runs into knight f2. So you have to play something like king c2, but then I think black's plan would be something like rook to h6, and then bring this other rook to h8 and target the h pawn. So but h5 is a little bit has a little bit more power to it. So the idea would be that after, let's say, takes and bishop takes, this is actually the best move, but it's a little bit risky because after king f6, rook g6, if something like king to e7 happens, you have rook g7, which gets the rook on the 7th rank. King f6, the knight is hanging.
Okay.
The best move is actually, I believe, king f7, which is it's very.
But 7 in rook takes.
It's hard to put your king on the same diagonal as a bishop like this because of all the discovered checks. It just so happens in this position that none of the checks really work out because rook to h5 is a threat, and rook to h6 is a check, but then the king would just, let's say, move away, and nothing really happened. The one thing that black does have to be careful about here is that after rook to g1, this sacrifice doesn't quite work, because after check, king f6 would be checkmate here. But the thing that the black has king to e8, and after check here, you can play knight to f8, and he'll just be up a piece. So he manages to escape this way. That being said, this does make sense because it's a long-term opening of the position. This bishop can now, in a lot of, if you trade the rooks, maybe get in this way. So h5 trading the pieces does make a lot of sense. My opponent decided to play rook h6 instead. I took. Now he didn't take on g6 because of bishop h5, which would be pinning the rook and the king. But instead he played king g7. And his idea was essentially that this pawn here on g6 is so far away from the rest of my pawns and pieces that in a few tempos he can play moves like rook h8, rook h6, and just take the pawn this way. So I traded the rooks. And here this is another point. So essentially what you can see here is that this pawn is too far advanced that it really can't be supported by the rest of my pieces. His plan is pretty simple. He's going to go rook g8 and take the pawn. And unfortunately there's really not much that I can do here as white.
So you will do something faster?
So the idea is that while he is occupied doing this, I need to find another basically way of attacking.
Yeah.
So what are some of the candidate moves here that you guys would consider?
To open the position.
Open the position. That's the right theme. So how would you go about that?
So let's say moves like d5, f3, b4 to go b5.
I like c5 the most, but
c5 also, yeah.
Yeah, c5. So c5. C5, if I recall correctly, is actually the engine's #1 recommendation, which kind of goes against what I said because it's closing the position, but the idea is that it's really opening this diagonal for the bishop. So he has bishop c4,
and b4, b5,
targeting e6, yeah, and then you're going to be playing here. Eventually after b4, b5, open the b file, and hopefully bring a rook here to attack this way. So c5 is definitely a good idea. The problem with b4, b5 right now is that it's a bit too early, because right now if you get to b5, just c takes and then c takes, and you haven't quite opened it up. In fact, also you have to remember that by the time you really only have two tempi, because rook g8, rook g6 is pretty quickly. It's coming pretty quickly.
also do you want to prevent black to play c5 himself? I mean,
Black playing c5 here?
Yeah, I mean, at some point maybe b6, c5 or c5 right away to block the c4 pawn on this light square. And
I think black would be reluctant to play c5 because what you're doing there is let's say if you had played just king c2, let's say a waiting move after c5. The thing is that if you trade this, you transform to a situation where it's equal material, but white has a 3 versus 2 pawn majority on the queen side, and this 3 versus 2 with the e6 pawn, e4 pawn, and f5 pawn, this essentially can never create a pass pawn, but this 3 versus 2 can create a pass pawn. So the idea here would be that after something like this, the long-term advantage would be that you can create a pass pawn on the queen side, and black really can't create his own pass pawn on the king side. That's not to say c5 is losing, but that's the general reason that people would avoid that. The move that I played was king to c3, which is just activating the king, and the follow-up, which you mentioned, I believe, was after rook g8 to play d5 to open the position. So the idea is that basically, as white, I'm taking advantage of this inactivity over here. The king is kind of passive into the side. The rook is dedicated to taking this pawn. So while all these pieces are distracted from the action, to break through in the center, open the position, and get the king active. So the idea of d5 is that I'm threatening to take a pawn here, also threatening to take a pawn here, and basically forcing a big exchange here. And the thing is that white has sacrificed a pawn here, so it is a bit of a
You have access.
But the thing is that after king to d4, there's a clear path for the king to enter. So the best move I think here is knight to f6. But after something like king to f5, king to e5, this king is very active. And I would argue that the activity of the king combined with the weakness of this pawn and this pawn, which are all very vulnerable, would compensate for the pawn down. Also, this pawn down, white's still equal material, and after something like rook g6, I think rook to h8, king g7, king f5, you're getting the pawn back already. Then the king would come back and target this. It's just you can see already just visually the huge difference in the king activity. So my opponent played rook g6 to just trade the pawns, and immediately you can see white has really gotten a lot of what I said the bishop wants, right? There's pawns on both sides of the board, so you can see that there's the 2 versus 2 on the queen side and the 2 versus 2 on the king side. It's a much more open position because you traded so many pawns, and the king is very active. Not to mention the fact that these 2 pawns here are more or less fixed on light squares, meaning that if the king ever would try to come here to defend the queen side, these pawns would be huge targets on the light squares. So you can see that white, using some tactics, has really achieved most of the positional goals. Opening the position, getting pawns on both sides, and fixing the pawns on light squares. Again, that's not to say that white's immediately winning. I think black can still hold a draw here with correct play. But you can see that white has made a lot of progress compared to earlier when the position was much more locked in, when there's still pawns here and here and all over the board. So to king f6, king d6, the king is just continuing to really activate. And the king maintains the opposition against this king, which means that this king is essentially blocked off from coming to the queen side. And the threat for white would be something like king to c7 and just start taking these pawns. And the idea is that if there ever got to be a situation where there was the pawn race, the bishop would be a valuable piece in the sense that the bishop could support the push of the pawns on the queen side and restrain black's counterplay on the king side, which you'll see is a bit kind of what happened. So here he played knight to e5, and he basically realized that his position is very passive here, I would argue. You can see that the king here is restrained, the knight is behind. White has a lot more activity, white has a lot more prospects. And the idea of knight to e5 is to create counterplay. So there's 2 basically schools of defense. One of them is passive defense and one of them is active defense. This is definitely an example of active defense. There's no real rule of which one's better, but it depends on the circumstance. But you can see here that this example of active defense, in almost all contexts, active defense poses more practical problems for your opponent because there's specific threats that you really have to worry about. Passive defense usually is, I would say you're usually trying to set up a fortress or trying to just maintain your position without creating additional weaknesses, which, at least from a practical perspective, can be very grueling just to maintain that position for so many moves, because the opponent would typically just keep grinding. But active defense here, it forces the issue. But in some cases, like this one, for example, the active defense doesn't quite work. Because here it basically gets to a position where king to c7, knight to d3, king b7, knight f2. So what's going to happen here is the way this game's going is that it's going to be basically a race where white has his pawns coming here and black has his pawns coming here. Now, at first glance, you might think that the black pawns are further up, right? You see that they're already on the 4th and 5th rank, and the white pawns are still in the 2nd rank. But there are a few things you have to take into account. This is where you really see the strength of the bishop versus the knight, because the knight takes so much longer to move around the board that the knight would be basically forced to exclusively focus on the pawns pushing or exclusively focus on defending. And the bishop, on the other hand, can restrain these pawns in a much easier way. And then you can also see that white also has a bit of time to get his pawns rolling before these pawns start coming. Unfortunately, the move bishop g4 doesn't work because this pawn would be promoting too quickly because it's after something like this. You already have a queen, and then it's just after b7, just queen takes with the check, king moves somewhere, and even something like check here, and just you're going to promote another pawn here. So instead I played b4, knight takes, and then b5. And here the problem is that after, let's say, f4, this pawn is a little too fast because after f3, takes. Actually, I'm not. After takes, here the correct move would be bishop to b5. And the idea of bishop to b5 would be that after here, when you promote, you can just take and then promote. So instead my opponent played knight to d5 with the idea to restrain the pawn. And a common idea in these positions would be something like after b6 to go knight to e7. The idea of knight e7 would be that after, let's say, c6, there's moves like knight c6 and then knight b8. And the basic idea here is that if you attack the king this way, without a bishop, without a bishop, you can check. And so that's the standard defense. The problem here is that this is another example of the bishop being dominating the king, because the bishop here is still defending these pawns, but it's also controlling the important square of a6, which means this knight's just trapped. So you can see here that the bishop is actually dominating this knight even from this so far distance away. After b7, there's also the idea that you could play a move like, let's say, f4, the idea being that if you promote the queen, you run into knight c6. But again, you'd have something like bishop to b5, where the bishop would dominate this knight again, the knight can't come here, and then next move, white's going to promote a pawn. So then, basically what my opponent did is that he basically saw that this bishop was going to be able to simultaneously dominate the knight and restrain these pawns. So he took. And then played f4. So this game is not at all over yet, because these two pawns are very far advanced and they're very strong. The thing is that this king is basically too far away. After a move like king c5 and king e5, black would really get the opposition, which cuts this king off, so the king can't quite come back to defend. So the best way to proceed for white would be to play a4, creating his own threats. So f3 is the right move, and then so the bishop has to move, right? But the question is where. So
only move, no? This one?
Sorry?
Is it only move?
Yeah, I definitely only move to win. It might even be only move not to lose.
Oh.
Like c4, but
Bishop c4, I'd say
kind of
pushes e3.
Say it again?
If bishop c4, he will of course push.
Bishop c4, e3, yeah.
But it's not so hard to calculate because he has only one move to play. There's always tricks in these positions. So it's never, you can never, even the pawn races, they're not always just a race. You always have to worry about the kings, you have to worry about everything. But the problem is here is that a5, e2, it's a bit slow. Yeah.
Which is also true for pretty much anywhere in this diagonal. In fact, bishop f1 is even worse because then e2 is going to come with a tempo.
So then it's bishop d1.
So bishop d1, exactly. The idea of bishop d1 is that this pawn is really restrained because then you can take this pawn. And if you play f2, then the bishop comes back to e2, and now white has a blockade in the light squares here. So the only way for black to make progress here is to play king to e5.
It's too slow, no?
Well, you'll see. So king to e5, a5, king f4, a6, e3, and here this is a position where we have to calculate and find the win for white.
Yeah, just 8.
What do you think?
I'm calculating.
Alright. Take your time, take your time.
Yeah, the H3 is the first thing I was looking at. It looks...
Because there is a check, so it has to be...
Are there only 2 candidates move? Like, it's either A7 or Bishop takes F3?
Yeah, those A7 and Bishop takes F3 are the... Because any king move is kind of slow.
Doesn't make sense.
I would say A7 because he said Bishop take F3, so we have the 2 options.
Alright, so Bishop takes F3 is the stronger move. The idea is Bishop takes F3 is that you are forcing the king to F3, and then the point is that A8, which is where you promote, is going to be check.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Wow.
So Bishop takes F3, King takes F3, A7, E, and here he resigned. But the idea is that E2, yeah.
Wow.
As he mentioned, it's a draw. I'm sorry, it's a draw for black if it's a pawn here, a pawn here, a pawn here, or a pawn here.
Yeah.
But then this pawn, this pawn, this pawn, and this pawn are all winning for the queen. The reason is, as I'm sure you can say, is that the basic winning plan would be that you're going to force the king in front of the pawn. Not to.
And slowly.
You're going to force the king in front of the pawn, and here you check. If the king comes here, you can take, and if it comes in front of the pawn, you can bring the king in and do the whole thing over. Force the king in front of the pawn anyway. So this was the full game. He resigned after A7, and so the point of this game you can see is that this was an example of how the bishop was able to really dominate the knight. And like I said before, you did that by white opened the position, white maintained the pawns on both sides of the board, and combined the activity of the king with the bishop. So do you guys have any questions about this specific game before I go to the next one?
It's just funny that the bishop was dominating, but it was almost sleeping here on
E2.
I mean, it doesn't move for a long time.
But it has so much scope because it was controlling so many squares on this here and here, and it's often in chess there's a saying that the threat is stronger than the execution, which is just that the option for white to even use it really modifies black plays to the extent that he has to take it into account. But the bishop on E2 is much stronger. By comparison, a knight on, let's say, E7, or even the same in E2 would really only control squares within this perimeter here, which means the bishop is much stronger. So the next game was this was last summer in 2019 in the U.S. Junior Championship, and I was black here. And this was almost the opposite situation. So in this game, I had the knight versus the bishop.
Sign please. Okay.
So it was this is in my opinion an example of how the knight can outplay the bishop, which is kind of the opposite. So it was a French defense. We'll go kind of quickly through the opening because it's not as important. This is all basically theory.
There is one complicated line.
There's a very complicated line. Exactly, yeah. He played bishop f1, so the line you were talking about was bishop b3, bishop f5, knight f5, knight check, takes.
I think black is fine at the end, but...
Black is fine, yeah.
The king comes to...
King here, check, king g6, and then usually c3, knight h5.
But there are some better moves, I think, than knight h5.
I think knight h5 is and then it's something like bishop to e3.
Or after.
Bishop e3 or bishop c1 are the two moves here. But this is kind of beside the point. But you're right, this is a very theoretical line, and I think the general consensus is that black can equalize here, but it's particularly this is the sort of position I would argue it's much more fun to play if you don't know the theory. Because if you know all the theory, it can be a little just kind of repeating what you've seen in the computer.
Yeah.
But if you get this fresh position, it's a lot of tactics. I mean, the immediate threat would be queen g4 here, which is mate in 2 because queen g4, then king f6 and queen g5. But I decided basically to avoid that. So, like you said, he played bishop f1 instead, which is actually similar. And again, the idea is that after bishop d6.
So you would have played bishop e7?
I played bishop e7. Here is this line's actually a little bit different though because castles is more or less not played. The reason for that being is that if you play the same exact line here, the bishop is much better placed on f1 than b3 because it can attack it this way. So the main move here, as far as I know, is actually king to f8, and then actually the move would be is queen d4, and after takes you play queen f6 actually, because after takes you have bishop h6 and this would be mate. And here, if I remember correctly, the best move is either h6 or h5. I can't remember which, but the idea would be that it basically allows the rook to defend this h6 square, and it gets to a complicated position. I know there was a game in this line between Sam Shanklin was white and Akshat Chandra was black, I believe, in the U.S. Championship a few years ago. But it's a very interesting line. But I decided not to go into that. I played bishop e7, which is a little bit more conservative and a lot less risky, I would argue. So he played queen f3, castles, bishop b5, bishop d6, and here we get both sides are castled safely, which is unlike all the other lines in this thing.
Should be equal, no?
I'd say white is a little bit better because this bishop here is pretty passive because this pawn's blocking, and white has a long-term advantage of a 3-on-2 on the queen side. But I would say this is it's a manageable position for black. I think in a lot of positions with black, it's standard to be maybe slightly worse out of the opening just because you went second, and this is definitely, I wouldn't say this is equality yet, but it's
very solid for black.
But it's solid, and I would argue it's a standard position. So he played rook d1. I played queen b3, queen b6, excuse me, and then queen b3, queen c7, and he played knight to f3. A theoretical move here, I believe, is queen g3. So a lot of people are really desperate to trade queens here, basically because they recognize that this endgame for black can be a bit passive with this bishop here, and the 3 versus 2 on the queen side creating a pass pawn.
So if you come back.
I think the people like to argue that the queen is slightly better placed than g3 because it has more attacking potential. But I would imagine that there have been some draws being played like that. But he played knight to f3 instead. The idea is basically to reroute his knight to e5. And from e5, he can maybe start to attack on the king side with moves like f4. Or he can just play at an e5 to target this bishop and prevent it from going to d7. So I played bishop e7, knight e5, and here rook d8. So the idea of rook d8 is that if I'm given the opportunity, I want to play bishop to e8, where it's very solid. Had I played bishop e8 in this position, my coordination is a bit clumsy because this rook is stuck here, and this rook can never go to d8 because then he would take, and then I'd lose the pawn on b7. So this move is actually critical to play first, and here he played knight d7, which is trading. So on one hand, I got rid of this kind of problem bishop here, which was very passive. On the other hand, I'm going to go into an endgame with a bishop versus a knight in a very open position with pawns on both sides, which is, just as I explained before, kind of all the circumstances you want to avoid. I would argue the situation is a little different, which I'll explain why, because the position is less fixed. So I, as black, have the flexibility to put both the pawns on the colors I want, and I have the flexibility to activate the king, and you'll see how I kind of manage this. So after rook takes e7, queen takes e7, he really wanted to trade. He played queen d3. So after queen, there is a. So I traded here. There's a famous endgame. It was played, I believe, between Bobby Fischer and Mark Taimanov in the candidates matches. I don't know what year, but it was the candidates matching leading up to the 1972 match. And it's referred to as the Fischer Ending. And what that usually means is the combination of a rook and bishop versus a rook and knight. Now the difference was that in that position it was completely symmetrical, so it was a 3 versus 3 and a 3 versus 3 on both sides. This is a little different because there's a 3-on-2 here versus a 4-on-3. And what that means is that there's really only one fully open file. In that game there was 2 open files, so it was a little bit more open. This is a little bit more closed. My opponent was basically thinking that this quote-unquote Fischer Endgame is known to be better for the bishop, so he thought this would just be a nice advantage here. I would argue that it's slightly better for white, but definitely kind of equal. Not equal, but manageable. So I played king f8, just activating the king. That's just another useful... there's a lot of moves like king f8 that you can think of. You can almost always rather your king be on f8 than g8. In a lot of lines, the king's can come here faster to defend. If the king would be on d6, it's just controlling a lot of important squares like c7, which could be entry square. The king's doing absolutely nothing on g8, and you want to have it more active. It's basically a basic rule. And here he played a4, which I would argue is his first mistake.
a4 is a mistake?
I would argue it's a mistake.
Okay, you went knight. Okay, so you use the b4 square?
The reason I would argue this is a mistake, not quite because of the b4 square, but because I mentioned earlier you want to have your opponent's pawns be on the same color as your bishop.
Okay.
Almost the opposite of that is that you want your pawns to be on the opposite color as your bishop, because you never want your pawns to be blocking your bishop. And what this led to was the option for me to play a5 and then b6. So here I have all my pawns here on dark squares, which means that this bishop is almost shooting into thin air on the queen side. This bishop now can never ever attack my queen side, basically.
Yeah.
Which is
so no target.
No target, and this is what I mean by having the pawns in the opposite colors. Now it's obviously this is not b6 is a bit of a problem right now, but if like after say rook b5, I can play knight d7, support the pawn, and then everything kind of worked out. So you played rook b5 and here knight d7. So basically what happened here is that another drawback of a4, by the way, is that it makes it much harder for him to create a pass pawn on the queen side. So a4, in my opinion, was actually a bit of a positional mistake, because it now the pawns are fixed on the dark squares, and it's difficult for him to create a pass pawn. The only way he can create a pass pawn would be playing something like c3 and b4 now. But the problem is that after c3, my rook's going to probably be on c8, and the b pawn can never really move because the b pawn is stuck defending this. So this is almost at a standstill. Meanwhile, as you'll see, I have the time to just gradually expand over here on the king side and do my own thing.
Isn't the h7 pawn hanging now?
h7, then there's g6, and the bishop is stuck. This is actually another Bishop Bobby Fischer theme here. Bobby Fischer played something very similar in, I believe it was not the first game of the match, but the first game that he showed up. Maybe it was the first game, but it was Spassky was white and Fischer was black. And Fischer played something. The bishop was here, he took here, basically, with the king on e1 or e2 or something, and he lost rather badly. But so he played king f1, I played king e7. So just a gradual activating of the king e2, and king d6. So the plan here is that actually his rook is so awkwardly placed that I could play maybe king c7 and knight c5, and then this rook is almost trapped as badly as the bishop would have been over here, because it can't come here because the pawn, it can't come here because the knight would be here, it can't go there because it's blocked, and it can't go there because it's blocked. So to get out of this, he played rook g5, which is a bit awkward. You see, the rook has no stable home. The rook wants to be on somewhere like d1 or e1, but these rook on g5 is just a little bit misplaced, I would argue. And here I played g6. Now, this is a little bit different because the queen side here, I'm putting all my pawns on light squares. So excuse me, dark squares. But the king side, they're all on light squares. The reason that's different is because the purpose of these pawns is to get rolling. And by rolling, I mean you want to play f5, e5, e4.
And it's blocking the bishop.
And it's blocking the bishop. These pawns are... The queen side is basically the side where black is weaker. So you want to have no weaknesses on the side you're weaker, and on the side you're stronger, you want to be able to develop the advantage.
But it's not always the case. That you should put all your pawns on the opposite color.
No, it's not always the case. It's it really depends on the circumstances.
Yeah.
And and another thing is that it depends if they're fixed or not. See, these ones here are fixed. When the pawns are fixed, which means they can't move, it's much more important to have them on the opposite color as the bishop. In this case, these pawns can basically move whenever they want. So I could play h6 and g5 and get them like that. these pawns have a lot more flexibility. So this arrangement is much more of a short-term arrangement. This on the other hand is this is very permanent on the queen side because these pawns aren't moving. So that's the difference. You can look at it as these are basically a permanent situation on the queen side versus a temporary pawn arrangement on the king side. He played bishop b5, and I played knight c5. Because at this point, this position is already getting to the point where the knight may be better than the bishop because the bishop has limited use on the queen side, which is why I didn't want to allow him to trade. Rook g5, rook g4. Again, he's really kind of struggling to activate the rook, and here e5. So already you can see, since these pawns aren't fixed, now this one's on a dark square too.
f5 is coming.
f5 is coming, h5 is coming. But the critical point here is that these pawns rolling, since they're completely unobstructed, you can basically choose which color you want them at any time because they have the flexibility to change at a moment's notice.
So maybe he should try b4.
b4 here?
No, b4. Yeah.
Here?
Yeah.
The problem with b4 here is that then these pawns are separated, and it becomes very, very difficult to create a passed pawn. Also, this knight can never be removed from c5. So he played c3. The idea of c3 is that at some point he wants to play your idea of b4 and take back with the pawn. Right now it doesn't quite work as knight a4, but it's more of a long-term plan. He's also he kind of figured out what's going on, and now he wants to put his pawns on dark squares too, so that his bishop is not blocked in. For example, the move c4 would be just a horrible move, basically blocking in this bishop, and also preventing him from ever creating a passed pawn. But c3 is a much stronger move. Here I played e4. Again, this is putting a pawn on a light square, but it's a completely different situation because this pawn. The goal of this is to, number one, restrain this rook because this rook is very awkwardly placed, and number two, eventually start rolling these pawns and create a passed pawn.
Maybe you have e5 also for the king then.
Exactly. Putting the king on a dark square because it's much just safer in general to put all your kings on dark squares that way you don't have to worry about
f5
bishop c6 and those ideas. He played rook h4 and again h5. Just a very awkward position for his rook. And here he played f3, which is correct. So he does understand the idea, and he's trying to open the position too because he realizes that this e4 pawn is really not, it's actually not a weakness, it's just closing the position. It's closing his rook, and it's actually closing some of the diagonals for his bishop, and he understood that what he needs to do is to take it. I, on the other hand, understood that kind of the opposite is that I didn't want to take that because I don't want to open it up. So instead I played king to e5. The idea of king e5 is that after f takes e4, knight takes e4 is a big blunder because of rook takes e4, and then bishop c6, which would win the rook or the king. But instead a move like rook d8 is actually quite pleasant because this rook is so bad. This pawn is so weak that I'm threatening moves like knight to b3 and then rook d8, rook d2. Also threatening moves like knight to e6, knight f4, and then g5, trapping the rook. This bishop is still tied down to this the whole time. Also, worst comes to worst, I'm also just threatening to take the pawn. So there's a lot of threats here. What he played was king to e3. I took this pawn here. The best move, if I recall correctly, was actually a very I don't know how to describe this, but a hard move to find was actually f5, which is what I wanted to play, but I was concerned that after takes and you take with a knight, it looks like the rook is very well restrained, but bishop c6 is a problem, which is simultaneously attacking both of these. And the best move here is a move that's the computer recommends. It's what people would refer to as a computer move, not human at all. No, the idea is rook h8 actually.
Whoa.
And that the point is that after you take here, you can play g5. And after rook takes here, you take this way, and this rook is still very passive. But rook to h8 is just very counterintuitive to just put a rook exclusively behind it, and I wasn't able to find that. So instead, I took here, he took back, and here I played rook a7. The idea of rook a7 is to support this pawn and swing the rook to the e file here, because I can't on e8 because the bishop is controlling. Played rook d4. and here now I'm starting to fix my pawns because, like I said before, since the pawns weren't fixed, now I can put them all in dark squares. So the idea is to play this pawn f6 and h4 so that these pawns are in dark squares, these pawns are in dark squares, and everything is perfect. He stops this, so he decides to play h4. The purpose of this is fixing the h5 pawn on a light square, which means that after f6, like I said, this pawn is stuck on a light square, and he tried to take advantage of that by playing bishop to e8. But after rook e7, bishop h5, rook h7, now we've traded. And now I've finally gotten basically the ideal situation. Dark square, dark square, dark square, dark square, versus light square and light square. These pawns are inconsequential because they're not fixed. But this pawn is fixed, and this pawn is also fixed, both of which on a light square.
Also, your king is slightly better.
King is more active. This is a bit of a side point, but I'm also going to create what's called an outside pass pawn over here on the g file. And then the idea is to bring the king over here. So here he played b4 and offered me a draw. So, I mean, I guess the first question is, would you guys consider taking the draw, and like what would you respond? You would no? What about you?
I would surely consider it, but I don't know. I need to play games because I'm a beginner. I need to play games to learn, so I don't take draws.
That's definitely a good attitude to have.
Just to learn.
I think I declined the draw. What he was hoping for, I think, was for me to take this pawn. He takes the rook, takes, and takes here. And the line here is that after takes, this actually is a draw though, because we're trading enough pawns that once it's only one pawn, it'll be a draw. But what I played instead was knight to e6, which more or less forces the trade of the rooks, because if he moves the rook, then I'm going to take on b4 with takes, takes, and takes. And again, now here, the pawn's still on a dark square, but it's outside pass pawn. So, additionally, this pawn on f3 is really going to be a problem because it's stopping the bishop on c6 from controlling the promotion square. So basically, the only square that he can really restrain my pawn anymore with his bishop is from h3. Beyond that, he's going to have to bring his king all the way back, which would allow my king to come in this way. He played bishop d7, knight f4, and the king f2, and at this point I think he was already starting to crack under some of the pressure because this just basically loses a pawn here because I can take, and check.
But it was losing.
It's not losing. I think objectively it's still, the computer can hold a draw, but it's very unpleasant.
Computer is holding?
I believe a computer is holding here, yes.
Oh.
Because since there's so few pawns on the board in a lot of these lines, like even this position I think is still a draw technically, with the move bishop f5, because there's so few pawns, and that a lot of variations, if you can sacrifice a bishop for one of the pawns and the king gets the other one, it's tricky to hold. But here he played bishop h3, which is losing. The reason is that now after knight c3, now it gets a little bit of a simpler situation, and basically what happens here is that this king can support this pawn, while this knight and this pawn can basically promote, because this bishop can only really control. I played b5 here, so the only two squares where this bishop can stop this pawn are light squares, right? Which is b1 and b3. And now one of the benefits of the knight over the bishop is that although the knight is a short range piece versus a long range piece, although there are pawns on both sides of the board, this side's kind of irrelevant because the kings are going to be over here. It's just going to be the knight is able to control pretty much any square on the board. Not pretty much any square on the board. The dark squares and the light squares, whereas the bishop can only control half of them.
Yeah.
So, like every one of these squares, this bishop is never gonna help with, right? Which means that the only squares that this bishop can ever hope to stop me from promoting on are this square, this square. Now this knight can support those squares, moves like knight c5 or knight c3, which control these squares. And it can also support the b4 square, the b2 square, any square. So the knight is very good at supporting the pawn against the bishop. So what happened here is he played king g4, knight c3. So knight c3, the idea of knight c3 is really to restrain this king. So what happens here is that the knight is going to be controlling e4. So after bishop f1, b4, king f5, king e7, this king is actually completely blocked out.
Nice.
The king can't come this way because the knight is controlling this, the pawn's controlling this, and the king's controlling this. So his only way of doing anything is to come back around, which wastes valuable time. He played bishop c4, and here I played knight b1. And he actually resigned in this position. The idea is that if he plays king to e4, I can play knight to d2 and force the trade. And then I'm going to win this pawn here. And after any other move, let's say king g4, then I can play knight to d2. And then I'm supporting both of the promotion squares at once. So the bishop is attacked, the bishop moves, let's say here. I push again, and I promote. Meanwhile, this king is still cut off because the king can't come here. So he has to take an even longer route, and by the time he gets around, all are promoted. And then I still have a pawn here, and it'll be an easy win with a pawn remaining. So I guess this is so this is just a resignable position here because bishop c4 is more or less forced because otherwise there's no other way to stop b3. And then after knight b1, the plan is just knight d2, b3, b2, b1.
Knight b1 is very nice.
Yeah, it was knight b1 may be the only winning move. I haven't analyzed this that deeply, but it's actually possible that knight b1 is the only winning move because black's to some extent is in Zugzwang here because the king can't move anywhere without giving up this pawn. And if you give up this pawn, it's definitely not a win because then this bishop can sacrifice itself for this pawn and it's a draw. And the other knight moves, knight e2 is obviously losing. Knight e4, not good. Knight d1, I wouldn't be a fan of because after knight d1, you're letting the king come back to defend. Knight a4 has a similar problem, although knight a4 you may be able to get away with this because of b3 and after take you have knight c5.
Yeah, maybe knight a4 also.
But knight b1 is definitely the most elegant and the best too. So I was happy to find this one, and it was an important one for me. So you can see this is a bit of an opposite situation where the knight was able to beat the bishop, and the knight was able to do this primarily by fixing the pawns on the dark squares on the queen side, and then eventually, much later, but eventually getting all the pawns on the dark squares on the king side too. And then once you combine that with an active king and an outside pass pawn, it was good enough to win. So I hope these two games kind of showed you kind of the nature of these bishop versus knight endgames. They were really two sides to the same endgame, and I hope if you guys today or tomorrow reach a bishop versus knight endgame, it can help you in the game. Do you have any questions about this game, the first game, or just anything in general? Any questions? Thank you so much for having me.